Hello, everyone. First, I'd like to thank CapEcon for the invitation to come speak today. Thank you all so much. I'm honored to be here. My name is Catherine Clark, and I am the managing editor of Pecan South, the official trade magazine for the pecan industry. I've been in the industry for about 6 years now, and I've had the privilege of witnessing how the international market has changed during this time. And so today, I'm going to dive deep into the international pecan market with the hopes of giving you insight and knowledge of how pecans move around the world. When we think about the pecan market, we first must keep in mind that it is still heavily based on supply and demand. The pecan market does not rely on commodity pricing, so there is no set price. Instead, prices are determined by how many pecans are available and how much demand there is currently. So prices are also influenced by brokering and contract negotiation between buyers and sellers. For supply, there are several major components to each crop: the current year's global production and carryover. As for demand, we've recently seen a big jump in consumption, and demand is the second big indicator for future price trends. So let's look deeper into supply and the factors that influence the international market. As I mentioned, when we think about supply, we first focus on the current year's production. How many pecans is each country expected to harvest? And how many pounds or tons of pecans do growers actually bring in? So when we think about this, we can't just think about Argentina's production or Mexico's or the United States. It is truly about global supply and global production, and that is what directly affects the international market. Additionally, the US is no longer the only dominant source of pecans. Mexico produces just as many pecans and exports well over half its crop to the United States. Another thing we should note is that the US and Mexico share a long history with pecans. So pecans are both native to Mexico and the US. And frequently, pecans grown in the United States are sent to Mexico to be shelled and then sent back over to the US to be sold in grocery stores, etc. Later on, I'll be sharing some production numbers for the United States. And it's important to note too that those numbers do not count crops from other countries. So they're only production numbers for the US, not for Mexico, South Africa, Argentina, etc. Next, another factor that plays into pecan supply is the seasonality of harvest. And this has a big effect on the international market. For the United States and Mexico, harvest takes place from September to January and sometimes February, while for the Southern Hemisphere, yourselves, South Africa, Australia, your harvest, of course, is from April to June or July. Now, the early availability of your crop has had an impact on the international market, and I'll touch more on this when we talk about specific markets later in the presentation. It's important we also note that another aspect of harvest timing in the Northern Hemisphere are the different regions. So in the US and Mexico, different regions start and end harvest at different times. South Texas and parts of Mexico typically begin harvest first in early or mid-September. And these growers sell the majority of their crop on the gift pack market, which is the holiday market, and they often receive the highest prices. Once we hit October, growers in other parts of Texas, Georgia, the southeastern United States also start to harvest, and harvest picks up in Mexico as well. But for growers in West Texas or the western part of the United States, as well as a few parts of Mexico, they do not start harvesting until late November, and sometimes not even until after Christmas. And so what they'll do is they wait until they get their first freeze before they harvest. And then they typically sell most of their crop on the commercial or wholesale market. This leads us to our second major component that determines supply: carryover. So carryover is how much inventory buyers and shellers have on hand when harvest begins. If shellers and buyers have a lot of pecans in storage or inventory when the new crop comes in, they are of course not going to buy as much. And I mentioned these growers in the Northern Hemisphere who don't start harvesting until late November. They're important because they oftentimes, if the price is too low, they will place their crop into storage and hold on to it into the new year. And many of these growers try to sell their crop by March or April. And some sometimes don't even sell at all until June or July. And so this not only impacts carryover numbers, but it also affects global supply because it's right around the time when you all begin harvesting. In the US, we have two resources we can use to determine carryover numbers. First, carryover is tracked by the US Department of Agriculture, specifically the USDA National Ag Statistics Service, and it's funded by the APC. And they'll often refer to carryover as carry in or simply inventory. Another resource comes from the American Pecan Council, and they track commitment, inventory, and they also provide data to the industry each month. Lastly, we need to take note of future supply trends. So we know in the future we're expected to have increased production worldwide, and there's also a larger trend of vertical integration, where people are growing pecans, shelling pecans, and then exporting them themselves. Now on this slide, we see data from the USDA NASS Non-Citrus Fruits and Nuts Summary. And this report is published every May and shows data on the recent pecan crop. And here we can see what the USDA says is the total amount of pecans produced in the US in 2022, 2021, and 2020. And also note, please, that the USDA only reports on the top 5 producing pecan states. So they don't account for 10 other states in the US that harvest pecans. These 5 states do produce the majority of the US crop, though. On this slide, we have an example of the American Pecan Position Report, which I mentioned, and you can find these at americanpecan.com/data-reports. And here you see information on inventories, shipments, commitments, etc. And lastly, here's the total inventory for pecans in the US at the end of July 2023. We currently don't have the August report or the year-end report. So this is the most recent information we have, and it can give us insight into what the current carryover is for this year's harvest. I also mentioned the net open position. This is a number included in the APC position report that shows how many pecans US handlers have in their inventories that are not contracted or committed. So these are pecans that they are holding on to that they have available for sale. And these are numbers from August 31st for the last few years. Again, we don't have this year's numbers yet. So when thinking about supply, we also want to look at global production, and these figures come from a variety of sources and showcase the current estimated production for 2023. And we can see worldwide, there's expected to be 857 million pecans harvested this year. Next, demand and consumption also are major influences in the international market, and demand is one key indicator for future price trends. Overall, net consumption in the US has grown 3% over the last decade, but until recently, pecan consumption was stagnant. Since 2017, however, there has been a 36% increase in pecan consumption in the United States and a heightened awareness of pecans. And in 2020, there was still an 8.5% increase during the pandemic. And this growth in consumption can be directly attributed to the American Pecan Council's consistent marketing efforts over the last several years. Demand is also growing internationally, even through the pandemic, even through logistic issues and the recent economic downturn. And all of those have affected global demand, but we're still seeing an uptick in consumption. Lastly, a major influence on the international markets is, of course, global affairs and current events. Regulations, tariffs, trade agreements, political upheaval, and other global happenings all inevitably impact the market and price. And one great example I can give is the US-China trade war in 2018. We went from having a 7% tariff on US pecans going into China to a 47% tariff and then a 100% tariff in the span of about 6 months. And with these tariffs in effect, the Chinese market basically dried up for growers in the US. China put additional regulations in place that made shipping or buying pecans from the US extremely expensive and difficult. And so Chinese buyers turned more and more to South Africa and Mexico to fill their inventories. Another good example of current affairs impacting the international market can be seen in Europe this year. So we saw a big slowdown in exports going to Europe because of the Ukraine-Russia war. And these world events will always play a big role in the international market and contribute to this back and forth between supply and demand. So how do we know what production to anticipate in the coming crop year? We can use crop estimates to understand what crop yields to expect. In the US pecan industry, we use data-based estimates and then also industry estimates to understand the crop. The US Department of Agriculture releases 2 production estimates in January and October, and then an official production report in May of each year, which I showed you in the previous slides. These reports use surveys to gather data from growers across the country and are funded by the industry. Over the years, the USDA moved from reporting on all 15 pecan producing states to only reporting on the top 5. We also have 3 industry estimates or guesstimates because we are guessing at what the pecan crop will be. And these are done by different pecan organizations leading up to harvest and rely on word of mouth to determine the coming year's production totals. So here you can see the estimates for the US crop this year, as well as an estimate for how many pecans will be imported from Mexico to the US. The American Pecan Council recently conducted a Land IQ study with satellite imagery in an effort to get a better understanding of the pecan acreage in the US. And the goal of this was to gather more data so that the industry can create better estimates. We're not there yet, but this information was very helpful in understanding pecan production and getting us closer to our goal. Now that we've established an understanding of the major influences for the international market, let's dive into the market itself. When people talk about the pecan market, they usually refer to 3 different types: retail, wholesale, and export. The retail market is generally the gift pack market, or it's growers who sell directly to consumers through their own shops or online. The wholesale or commercial market refers to selling to grocery stores, big box stores, or to shellers who then sell to large retailers. And lastly, the export market is, of course, the international market. When talking about prices, growers typically use per pound or per point to refer to prices. And here are the conversion formulas between the two. And then the prices for kernels or shelled product is often referred to as meat prices and uses per pound. With this in mind, let's take a look at the current state of the international market. So here's a graph showing export data from the American Pecan Council on the total pounds of pecans exported from the US over the last few crop years. We currently do not have the August 2023 report, so this only goes up to July of this year. But with this graph, we can see a sort of ebb and flow to the export market. Typically, there's a climb leading up to March, and then a decline through the months before harvest. And it kind of falls in line with when your crop comes in as well. We see this big drop in April through July. This year, exports, were down at the beginning of the year and then rebounded a little in March. And there are several reasons for this, including the Ukraine-Russia war, inflation, economic hardships, etc. Now, diving into specific markets. The European market is the oldest market for pecans outside of the US and is the most mature. Europe is an all-shelled market, so only shelled product is shipped to Europe, as most of the pecans in Europe have been traditionally used for bakery items like chocolates, pies, sweets, cereals, etc. The health focus has not hit Europe yet, but the industry is making efforts to promote pecans as a versatile snack and ingredient and to educate consumers on its health benefits. One issue we have with the European market is tracking pecans and gathering data on where they go. So once a shipment gets into port, we don't actually know what market it is going into in Europe. In the APC's position reports, you'll often see a large number of pecans going to Germany and the Netherlands. And that is because these are major ports. And those numbers skew the entire data report and make it hard for us to track pecans through Europe. For the Middle East, there's not much known about your average Middle Eastern consumer, and we currently do not have an industry-led marketing effort in this region. Most pecan marketing going on in the Middle East is being done by private companies or individuals. So what do we know? Well, first we know Middle Eastern consumers love nuts, nuts are featured in a lot of traditional dishes, and pecans could easily be incorporated into both traditional and new recipes. So, for instance, think pecan baklava. There's also a huge opportunity for pecans as both an ingredient and snack food in the Middle East. Bowls of high quality nuts are often used to welcome guests into homes or resorts or hotels. And according to the American Pecan Position Reports, we know that Israel traditionally imports the most pecans out of the countries in the Middle East. As of July, Israel imported about 2.8 million pounds of pecans from the United States from September 2022 to July 2023. And that's compared to 2.7 million pounds last year. Previous marketing efforts have occurred in Turkey, and it was led by US growers, and those efforts date back to the 2010s. And what we do know is Turkey has beautiful nut stores where people go and they buy premium pecans and, excuse me, not pecans, premium nuts. But pecans could tap into this luxury market, especially as an exotic or premium nut. We also know that there have been some major nut companies that had been bringing pecans into Turkey, but the high tariff and the lack of consumer awareness were barriers to entry and really prevented them from making a lot of sales. So, in order to truly gain access into Turkey, we need to get tariffs lowered and really start educating consumers on pecans. Another big country or market in the Middle East that's available to us is the UAE. Pecans are used as a high-end food item and are generally recognized by consumers in Dubai. And the UAE has imported about 611,000 pounds of pecans from September 2022 to July 2023. But besides that, there's not much known about this market, and there's no marketing, industry-led marketing going on at this moment. Saudi Arabia also imports pecans and roasts them with various flavorings. And Saudi Arabia is the second largest pecan importer in the Middle East, with about 1.8 million pounds imported from September 2022 to July 2023. But again, this is a market we need more research on. And so for the Middle East, the big key takeaway is we need more marketing efforts, we need research, and we need to educate consumers if we want to get into these markets. As for China, China is a large gift-giving market. Chinese consumers' interest in pecans is rooted in the Chinese New Year. So Chinese consumers thought pecans looked like little brains, and so they made a great gift to give during the New Year to wish people good brain health. Additionally, China primarily imports in-shell pecans. According to the APC July 2023 position report, China has imported about 17 million pounds of in-shell pecans from the US between September 2022 to July 2023. And the Chinese people love to crack pecans together, and that community aspect of sharing in-shell pecans and cracking them together is a major driving point for the Chinese market. There have been several marketing efforts to drive demand for shelled pecans, and these efforts mainly focused on young professionals who don't have time to crack their own nuts. And so we are starting to see more shelled product in China, but a lot of that is going to bakeries. Most people in China don't have ovens in their homes, and so they go to the bakery to get bread and other goods. And the industry has been focused on selling shelled pecans as ingredients to bakeries rather than selling individual packets like you would see at a grocery store. As I mentioned previously, the US-China trade war in 2018 greatly disrupted this market. China had already started buying pecans from South Africa, but after the tariff increase and the new regulations, most buyers turned completely to South Africa and to South America to fill their pecan needs. And this really shows how harvest timing plays a big role in what international markets are open to whom and at what time. So Argentina and other countries in the Southern Hemisphere, you all have a huge advantage in the China market. You harvest early enough that Chinese buyers can fill their New Year orders with plenty of time before the holiday. And this year, I've heard from several growers and industry members that China has started showing interest in the US and Mexican crops because the South African crop was so small. So that's a perfect example of how supply is one of the driving forces of the pecan market. But like I said, you guys have a great advantage for the China market. Beyond these international markets, I would also recommend growers and industry members look into India. This year, India reduced its pecan tariff from 100% to 30%. And since that went into effect, Indian buyers have been showing enormous interest in pecans. So India is entering the picture, and this market is definitely going to come into play very soon. Many people think India will be an in-shell market, but we don't know for sure. And like China, India has a large population of young professionals. So there's that opportunity for a shelled market as well. The main issue with India will be logistics. India is still a very tough market to move product through while keeping it fresh and maintaining quality. And so there are concerns that once the pecans get to India, their quality cannot be ensured. So as I mentioned, there's lots of room for growth in these markets and others that we didn't get to touch on, like South Korea. The industry is currently working on growing pecan consumption globally, and I know there are also multiple marketing efforts underway in other countries and other regions. To conclude my presentation, I wanted to take a moment to share some ways that you can stay informed as you continue to navigate the pecan business. First off, Pecan South is a fantastic resource. Our subscription offers you a monthly magazine as well as complete digital access to our website with monthly email newsletters. It features articles on growing pecans, but also industry updates that often touch on current marketing efforts. Additionally, we publish a weekly harvest and market newsletter from September through January. It's called the Pecan Newsletter. And although it primarily reports on the US and Mexico harvest and crop, the newsletter also covers prices, market conditions, and other tree nuts, and can provide you a great resource before your own harvest. I also suggest checking out the American Pecan Council's position reports and these other two reports at the bottom of the slide from the US Department of Agriculture. All three of these provide data on the US crop and will give you insight into current inventory, export, and commitment numbers. So you could keep an eye on the competition, if you will. Lastly, I recommend taking a look at Nuestra Reña, which is our annual Spanish magazine. In this year's edition, we feature an article from Nadia Ventesinque about the international pecan market and the business of exporting pecans from Argentina. So if this interests you, you can find it for free on our website. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I'll now welcome any questions.